are listening to Campus Purpose. I'm Cody Cook, and my guest today is John Dangelo III, also known as the anti-war war vet. John, what you been up to?
Nothing, man. I've been up to a bunch, but nothing in the realm of like the political space. I got another baby on the way. I'm buying a house, so I've been busy doing that and just enjoying having little kids.
Gotcha. Now, is this baby going to be like dropped from a plane, or how are you going to do with this one? The last one was born on a sidewalk, I believe.
Right. Yeah. Well, we live on a nice quiet road now, so we have been in talks with the OB doc about doing another road baby. I think we might be able to do it, but we'll have to see. I'm afraid of heights, so I don't want to be present for any airplane babies. But
you don't want to have the baby parachute from a plane.
It would be interesting. I wonder what their I wonder what the birth certificate would say then.
Oh my gosh. Well, what if? Okay, so let's imagine a scenario here, John. Let's say that the plane is flying along the U.S.-Canada border, and how do we do this? So then the baby starts to be born in U.S., but then you catch it in Canada. So it doesn't.
Yeah, because of the wind.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would probably qualify for dual citizenship, and because it would absolutely make headlines. And ideally, if we're the Canadian border, maybe I'm like fishing the Great Lakes, and that would be great.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have to. It's definitely she's only 10 weeks, so
okay.
We got a long way to go to plan this, and that'll be the next thing on the agenda is figuring out flight patterns, birth certificates.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see what happens. So I'm looking forward to it. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I had you here today to not talk about fun things, but what's going on in Afghanistan. So you have a background. You served in Afghanistan, and before you became an anarchist and decided to become against war. And I wanted to sort of talk to somebody who partly had been there, but also sort of shares some of my kind of libertarian sentiments and skepticism, and also my some of my Christian values related to war. So, as someone who was there and who's thought a lot about this war, and so if somebody's listening to this later or doesn't really know what's going on, we recently started pulling out of Afghanistan, and basically the Taliban essentially immediately came in and took it over. So I guess what I want to know is, from your perspective, what would you say our goal was in Afghanistan? Did we accomplish it? And then what went so wrong that the Taliban have basically taken over in very short order?
Well, the official, non-PR, heartwarming line is that we were occupying Afghanistan in the hopes of dismantling the safe haven that the Taliban offered to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, particularly after 9/11. And that was ultimately the justification for being there militarily for 20 years in various iterations. But you'll hear a lot of people talk about all the great things we've done for infrastructure and girls going to school, and you don't have to wear the burqa or the hijab if you're not feeling like it, which is all just absolutely ridiculous, sort of like post hoc justification to make this war feel a little bit more, palatable, I think, to the average SUV Prius driving soccer mom.
Sort of like in Iraq, where the real reason we went in was because of WMDs, but then we actually said, well, actually, it was to get rid of a dictator, Saddam Hussein.
Right. Well, or even more so to remake Iraq, because Saddam was always central to the policy that he would be. I think it started under Clinton, that there was an explicit policy that he would be removed from power was the stated aim of American foreign policy in Iraq. But it was never that we were going to remake Iraq in our image. And I think that sort of idea does run pretty parallel to what we've been trying to say through the media in many ways in Afghanistan, is like that we've remade this country into some, shining example of democracy, which is absolutely absurd, and was never going to happen and was never going to be the case, and is not what the people of Afghanistan would want or think of in terms of like a central governing authority, and is just, I mean, if that's the stated aim of the several thousand American dead, hundreds of thousands of civilian dead, and trillions of dollars we've spent, then, there should be some criminal prosecutions. But I don't, I think that anyway. So,
well, but what went wrong though? We were there for 20 years. You were kind of part of that mission to kind of help create infrastructure and keep things rolling. And you'd think in 20 years and giving all these weapons and all this funding and all this training, that we would have left the government, the puppet government, essentially, that we created, with some ability to manage, especially when you look at the number of, I think it was it maybe 300,000 in the Afghan security forces, and like maybe a tenth of that or less, and as far as Taliban forces coming in. These numbers are stuff I've listened to. I might have those wrong, but essentially the number of people that we had trained to hold Afghanistan was, dwarfed the number of Taliban that were coming in. And we had all this time, and yet this happened. So what went wrong, so to speak?
Well, so to the first point, the Afghan security forces has always been a central part of the policy in Afghanistan, that we were going to train these guys up and equip them, and that they were going to, fight for their home country in our place, so that we could eventually have some sort of clean but secure break from the country. And if any politician who was involved with that planning or general took 15 minutes and watched Afghan National Army training with the U.S. military, they would have thrown their hands up and called for the end of the policy right there. Because the Afghan National Army, I'd seen, I was a truck driver. I know I've said this on the podcast before, but just if people are listening to this in an isolated way, I was a truck driver, and our job was fuel security. So we would drive fuel from the main hub in southwest Afghanistan, Camp Leatherneck, all the way up to Camp Edinburgh, which remained in the same province there. And it's I think it was 100 miles one way or something. And we would stop in this little community called Shergazi. And in Shergazi, we would park our trucks and sleep for the night often. We would drop fuel at the base there. And there was a huge contingent of Afghan National Army that was consistently being trained. So we would see these guys training all the time. And it was like a entertainment that we could look forward to every time we went on this convoy, because they were just so absurd when they were being trained. So I have this one distinct memory. They were doing fire maneuvering. So they were in teams of 4, fire team, and the Marine infantrymen, or presumably whoever, was trying to teach them the positions and how to communicate, and, getting down prone on the ground and then communicating when you're prone. And so there's these guys in these ill-fitting flak jackets and helmets with M16s, and they're all being silly and talking to each other, very and I don't say this to be insulting. They were all young guys like me, but they were very childlike and playful and silly, and just it wasn't the military, in my understanding of the military at 21, being in the Marines for a couple of years and now fighting in Afghanistan. These guys were just having a ball, and they were rolling on their backs, and they were kicking their feet, and they were throwing their rifles all over the place, which is a big no-no. Your rifles always got to be close and secure, and yada, yada, yada. So they were violating all of the norms that we took for granted as this is how a military operates. And we're just kids hanging out. And the truth is, I didn't know this at the time, but most of these kids in the Afghan National Army are just that. They're kids, and they're going into the army because it is the most secure paycheck. And with the U.S. Subsidizing so much of it, the Afghan government was happy to pay these guys a salary to put the uniform on and go and, stand guard somewhere with the ANP, the Afghan National Police, who was a little bit more codified and, had a more legacy force. But these Afghan National Army guys, there's been plenty of reporting about like whole divisions of ghost soldiers. I think Patrick Coburn did a bunch of work on that, where like whole battalions of Afghan National Army never existed. They were just fake names for some general to say that, look at all the men under my command. It never happened. And those work their ways into these estimates. So I have no idea how many people were in the Afghan National Army or Afghan National Security Forces. I don't know that anybody has a really good number on it. But what I do know is that whatever percentage of that force was, young, pragmatic paycheck chasers, they weren't going to be a hedge, as we've seen. I don't think we realized just how little of a hedge they'd be against Taliban, but they weren't going to be effective against a bitterly experienced Taliban force who have been fighting guerrilla warfare for 20 years and had 10 years before that of being in power and operating in terms of, military logistics and stuff like that. It's just anyone who's been against this war has been saying from the beginning, but especially since like 2003, 2004, that this was, just as Scott Horton's book says, it's a fool's errand. And it was a battle we were never going to win because there was no real objective except to keep the safe haven, myth from happening.
I mean, I always sort of wondered if it was kind of more about having bases in certain places, kind of keeping down certain kind of political opponents, but I don't know. Maybe also, I mean, Israel. I'm sure, obviously, we have a very friendly policy toward Israel, and I think that has to do with a lot of our interest in the Middle East.
Yeah, Afghanistan is one of those countries, though. Like, you can wrap your head around Iraq in terms of Israel, right? Like Israel built the missile defense system because of Saddam, and he's been much more. There's been much more fighting and threat from Iraq to Israel and vice versa than Afghanistan. Afghanistan is very much, and Scott Horton talks about this a lot, and I just think it's like the perfect analogy, is it's kind of like the ruddy-cheeked, deep West Texan in the Middle East, and it's Texas-sized, and in many ways, not many ways, but in a few really fundamental ways, Texan in its culture. They're all armed. They're a warrior culture from time's beginning. They know the land and the layout. There's these insane geographical obstacles that are impossible to overcome for a normal military, and they have these factions of either ethnic, religious, political power, whatever, or all of them, all throughout the country that are completely at odds and have like these long-standing grudges well before. I mean, some of these ethnic relationships and animosities go back to like when there was a king. So, which was the 70s or whatever. I'd have to double check. But it's just it's an intractable problem on multiple fronts, and the notion of the safe haven, particularly, which has been sort of the cornerstone of the policy, has always been a bit of a farce. And we really dropped the ball. If our hope is that we don't let Afghanistan become a safe haven for terror, we took the country with the Al Qaeda forces immediately post 9/11, which numbered in like 200 to 400 guys. And maybe we kept Al Qaeda out of Afghanistan for the last 20 years, but it turns out now that they number somewhere between 70 and 100,000 people, and they're all over Asia and North and Central Africa. And that battle has been lost so profoundly, it's hard to really quantify.
So, I mean, when you talked about why the security forces sort of failed, it sounds like on some level they didn't take seriously what they were tasked to do, that it was a paycheck, right? And in that regard, it sounds like what we're talking about is sort of like you know, what with the I can't remember the Mises, economist Ludwig von Mises refers to as praxeology, that you know, we have our motivations for why we do things, and whereas the Taliban seemed very motivated to come in and take over Afghanistan, the security forces were not that motivated to keep it. And on one level, that seems like it could be surprising, because I think there are obviously going to be people in Afghanistan, people who are more secular, people who maybe have seen some of the cruelty of the Taliban, women in particular, who would want the Taliban gone, who, even if they're not necessarily super positive on the United States, they would at least say, okay, well, you know, in a lot of ways, this is better, right? So I guess I'm curious as to why you think maybe our Western notion of freedom was not enough of a motivation for some of these folks.
For the populace?
Well, yeah, and particularly these people who are in security forces, who just essentially, in many cases, just dropped their weapons as soon as the Taliban came in, and weren't even willing to fight.
I think the writing has been on the wall in Afghanistan since before I left in 2012. I got there in late 2011 and left in early 2012. So, you know, the Afghan National Army has never had the infrastructure or training or funding or equipment to be a legitimate hedge against a well-organized veteran combat force. I mean, that's been pretty clear. And the you know, Kabul is a perfect example, because they had the defense minister had done this walkthrough with Ghani like 4 days ago now, and was showing them the defenses. And this was
Ghani was the president who's left, right?
Right. Yeah. The now ousted or having fled Afghan president, but he was the president since like 2017 or something. And they had like a pretty significant defense setup throughout the capital city for the encroaching Taliban, and what they had assumed to be, you know, maybe months down the road or a month down the road, but you know, the writing was on the wall. Intelligence from the U.S., I'm sure, had let them know that they were, you know, there was this growing force of Taliban that was coming their way, and they had already captured all these cities and what have you. Kabul fell in with almost no bloodshed. It was there was really no fight. Most of the Afghan National Army just fled, and so even when they had some of that military Alamo infrastructure that you'd be hoping for, they didn't have the will to fight, because ultimately, like, you're fighting as a representative of a government that's artificial and understood to be artificial from just about everybody. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, or whatever, has had always an extremely tenuous claim to power and legitimacy. And yeah, the Taliban are going to face that same problem politically, but this broader civil war in Afghanistan, you know, between these various factions like the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, you know, Greater Pashtunistan and areas in the south and in the north, that's not going to go away. And the Islamic Republic didn't get all of the necessary sort of power players under their banner in support of them. It's always sort of felt, I think, in Afghanistan. I've been there one time, and I just happen to follow it closely because it's of interest. But my understanding is that the sense has been, as soon as the U.S. leaves, particularly their, you know, our air support and intelligence and stuff, once we're not dropping bombs and watching troop movements closely and stuff like that, the Taliban or whatever other more legitimate, more powerful force rolls in, is going to take over. And so, I guess to answer your question succinctly, I don't think the ANA really ever had much of a chance, because I don't think the ANA was ever really much of an army.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think it'd be safe to say that you would argue that we shouldn't have been in Afghanistan to begin with, but kind of allowing that we were there and that we sort of created the situation, and that leaving was going to create this power vacuum that some very dangerous people would likely try to fill. Which we could say the same thing about, what happened in Iraq when we left. So after jumping into this kind of whole quagmire, some would argue that we have an obligation to stay to keep the peace, which it appears that would mean that we'd have to stay there indefinitely because we were there for 20 years and
Right.
didn't seem to have any impact. So, I mean, does that logic carry any weight with you that we had an obligation to stay, especially when you look at some people now who are going to be damaged, especially by the relationship that they had with us while we were there? Like people that, for example, the Taliban may now target.
Right. Yeah, the interpreters and stuff is an interesting situation, primarily because it's been understood, just like in Iraq, that these people are really getting a raw end of the deal, and that they deserve support. And if they want to come to the U.S. or emigrate out of Afghanistan, that we should support them in that. I mean, we just spent $1 trillion building schools for girls that will be empty or blown up or torn down, and paving roads that are pockmarked with IED holes. I think we could probably spend the capital on getting these allies out of there. But much like, which seems to be the sort of typical American practice in contemporary military terms, we just leave these people high and dry. And another anecdote from my time in Afghanistan, but just to sort of elucidate the point about the Taliban and how ruthless they can be. There was this dude that he would sit outside the gate. He was given like clearance to sit outside the gates at Camp Edinburgh, where we would like finish our convoy and turn back around. And he would make these like, basically it was like French fries wrapped in like the traditional Afghan bread, like a burrito almost. And he would put like hot sauce and stuff on it and spices, and it was good. And he charged like $20 US for them. And we were all happy to pay it because we were flush with cash and hadn't had a warm meal. And he was a super friendly guy. He spoke English and whatever. He was making a killing selling French fries. And I didn't see it myself, but apparently the Taliban had come in the middle of the night and ripped him out of his bed and strung him up and, executed him outside of Camp Eddy. And so, they can be brutal to people that they view as allies of the West or NATO or ISAF or whatever. I think they do have a little bit of an incentive to use a lighter touch this time around. In 2010, 11, 12, they were slaughtering civilians in Afghanistan. But a point that isn't cited nearly enough, the Afghan National Army in the U.S., or allied forces have been responsible for the majority of civilian deaths in the last few years, particularly under Trump with the these huge bombing campaigns and what have you. So, I think that if you just kind of take a step back from the ethnicity end and the countries and stuff, and you just imagine yourself in the shoes of this agrarian culture, you're probably illiterate. You understand your country's history broadly as ebbs and flows of conflict, and you yourself being a part of it. And there's this rowdy religious right force, and maybe you're agnostic to the conflict. I think you'd still rather be under threat from your own countrymen and understand how to navigate those cultural and political situations than the political changing tides of the U.S. and then whatever that looks like from the air, as far as drone bombs go. So, Trump gets in office and the gloves come off and we start bombing all over the place. The average Pashtun Afghan doesn't give a about, excuse me for swearing, but they don't care at all about the American politics, except as it relates to them. And they've been subject to extreme atrocities over the last 20 years, and unfortunately, at this point, having gotten involved the way that we did, I think we'll continue to suffer tragedies for the foreseeable future.
Well, you talked about the Taliban wanting to have a lighter touch, and they have promised that there won't be reprisals for those who've worked with the U.S. And that they're going to be a little softer on women's issues. They've promised. Well, I don't. Ultimately, it's going to be a little softer if they do what they say they're going to do, because they're talking about letting girls stay in school, but then also, any journalists who are on television who are female will have to wear the full covering, and they don't want women working with men, and so women can still work, but there has to be an office where there's no men. So, but so I guess as a two-part thing, one is, I mean, do we trust them when they say this? And two is the motivation for saying something like that. You talked about that they have an incentive to use a softer touch, and I think you're right about that. And I think it's a two-part incentive. One is the international community they want to try to have better relations with, and two is there are obviously a lot of people in Afghanistan who would rather not see them in power, based on the fact that they were trying to flee and were holding on to landing gear on airplanes that were flying out of the airport. So perhaps part of the motivation for wanting to have a softer touch is to say to these people, hey, it's okay. Obviously we're the Taliban, we're kind of extreme, but we're going to be lighter, we're going to be softer, and you can live with it. And I think that's maybe the motivation of any government that is on that's not on totally sure footing, is to try to find ways to appeal to the people, to make them feel like it's not that bad. Maybe it's not perfect, but it'll be fine. And I'd rather just deal with it than fight, right? And so I think that's probably the motivation for wanting a softer touch. Maybe you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, but I am also curious if you think that there's any reason to trust the Taliban will have a softer touch.
I think that they are now going to get to experience the same tension, sort of Damocles thing that all people in power have to deal with, which is they have these competing interests that they have to try to satisfy. One being legitimacy and consolidating their authority in the state of Afghanistan, and then maintaining their internal culture and ethos that keeps the people, the Talib themselves, the students, as they refer to themselves, as loyal adherents to their rule, because they can't consolidate enough authority fast enough that they can lose the loyalty of the people amongst them. So I don't know how this goes for them. I don't know if they have a long-term projection. I'd love to hear like the Scott Alexander percentages on what he imagines will be, a Taliban central government in 10 years or something. But Afghanistan as a nation, like, as we imagine the geographical borders between India, China, Tajikistan, Iran, Pakistan, that is not like a hegemonic populace by any means. I think we all understand that. Much like most of these Middle Eastern states, the borders are in many ways sort of not arbitrary, but completely artificial. And so they don't really fall in line with manifest destiny, to say the least. So there's huge populations of people like the Hazaras and the Balaki or whatever down in the Southwest. I mean, there's huge groups of people who have long-standing resentment and grudges with the Taliban, and that isn't going to just fade away because now the U.S. is gone. If anything, it's probably going to make it worse. So I think that the Civil War has, the end of this is still, to be decided. But the Taliban have the claim at the moment, and I think that, whether they're going to be softer or not, they certainly should say that they are. And clearly they have a pretty good plan in place on how to get, their foot in the door and their seat on the throne. militarily speaking, they've done a great job of capturing key points of entry into Afghanistan, and surrounding these major cities without taking them until they have like the ability to, relative to American infrastructure and military presence. I think they've done a good job of like capturing and holding momentum in the last week or so. So we'll see what happens. I don't know what the outcome for the average school-age girl or worker, female worker in Afghanistan is going to be, but I think it's important to recognize that even mentioning it in terms of U.S. foreign policy in Afghanistan, it's a complete red herring and an absolute absurdity on its face. We would never launch a war on those terms or for those issues, and if we were, we would be in almost every country in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, because there are extremely different social and political and cultural norms. Female genital mutilation is still, extremely common throughout many parts of the world, and it's horrible. And I feel very much for these people that are kind of caught in the middle here. But American foreign policy was never going to be the solution to longstanding religious observance in a landlocked country in Central Asia.
I think that makes sense. And a lot of these arguments that have been made in the past for why we should invade this country or that country have been, well, look at the cruelty of the leaders or whatever. And you're right. Yeah, we would, if we applied that consistently, we would be everywhere, and it's not feasible. Although some might say, yes, we were already in Afghanistan, and we kind of created the complicated situation to some extent. And so maybe does that mean that we had an obligation to stay until? Yeah.
So I'm curious what you have to say about that, because to me, I think the only obligation we would have politically would be to Americans. And, we've made, that's sort of one of the nice things about having, being Joe Biden at the moment, is that you have a bit of plausible deniability. He's already tried to use that a little bit by saying that he was hamstrung by this Taliban deal and had to honor it or whatever, which is hilarious. Yeah. But
which he didn't exactly, because he pushed it out a few months, right?
Right. But to say like, well, I had to pull out. Trump already put me in this situation.
Sure.
But I think the idea of having an obligation to the Afghan government or the Afghan people is an absurdity. If you're gonna, I don't know what metrics one would want to use, but if you just think in terms of like, the standard of living and material comfort and safety of the average Afghan, especially in these hotly contested areas, are they better off having American drone bombs subject to political will and blustery political interests every 4 years, potentially taking over and ripping apart their homes, or are they better off like getting back at least to an Afghan-centric power structure and letting that sort of dust settle on its own, which has to be an inevitability unless we make Afghanistan the next satellite state like Puerto Rico, and we make it the 52nd state of the Union. I think our obligation has to end somewhere, and I think 20 years and trillions of dollars is probably sufficient, because every passing day is just another day that we're pushing off the inevitable sort of conclusion, whatever that is, that's going to come with this Afghan civil war.
Yeah, so yes, kind of how I would look at it. So from a Christian perspective, I support nonviolence all the time. So there's at every point, I feel like everything we've done has been wrong. But from a kind of a political or libertarian, especially libertarian-minded perspective, I do think that when you have wronged someone, you have an obligation to try to make restitution. And so I guess the question is, when you look at the balance sheet in Afghanistan, have we been a net negative or a net positive? And what do we owe if we're in the negative, right? If we're in the red, what is it that we owe to try to make things right? And I think maybe at minimum, the people that we made promises to and who put themselves on the line for us, maybe we have some obligation to those people, the interpreters, people who worked with us there, who could be in serious danger. But I think you're absolutely right, though, because there's not necessarily a right answer. Ultimately, if we are trying to protect people from the Taliban or from whatever terrorist group wants to come in, that ultimately means we stay there forever because they're not willing to take the reins. And so it makes it seem like there's really not a really satisfactory answer, that maybe leaving was the best answer, but it was still not a good answer, right? It was like, we're here already. Nothing is really going to be great. No choice that we can make now is going to be one we're going to be totally happy with, but at least this is one where we, rip the Band-Aid off now, as opposed to just doing it later. I mean, it's already later. So I ultimately supported the decision to leave, but it does seem that there were some people that got really kind of screwed in that process that we maybe should have been more loyal to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Also, though, I think in that same vein, I don't think the decision to assist an invading army is made lightly, and I think that these people understood the inherent risks in the decisions that they made, and that's not to say that they should just be left on the airstrip, or they can catch a ride on the
Sure.
wing of the C-130. But at the end of the day,
I agree they took a risk, but do you think that risk was based on their confidence that we were going to do something that we said we were going to do, right?
Well,
and then you have an obligation at that point.
I wish I can't help but kind of like laugh and smile at that, because if you're having confidence, especially as an Afghan, in American loyalty to small subsets of populations in countries that they're targeting for foreign policy, you evidently haven't been paying a ton of attention, because this is right out of the standard sort of American playbook. Sure. We've done this time and again. We did it in Iraq. We've done it in Syria. We've done it in South America, where we back these groups, and then when they're no longer convenient or useful, we let them go. I mean, that was the Bush Senior, terrible mistake that he had made in Iraq, was telling all of these people that he was going to have their backs against Saddam, and not actually coming through on that, letting them get slaughtered. So I don't think that there's an easy answer. And as I said at the outset of this episode, I support whatever capital needs to get put forward to get people that want to get out. I think that they're in a difficult situation, because what's been exposed in these last few days with this sort of shock and awe recapturing of all the major cities in Afghanistan by the Taliban is that, the Afghan government, the officially recognized Afghan government, has been a paper tiger for a very long time. When the Obama surge ended and troop numbers started to dwindle, we've been hovering between like 5,000 and 3,000 troops in Afghanistan. And it's an enormous country. We haven't been exerting legitimate military supremacy in that country for a very long time. Ultimately, it was air support in these small special operations groups that were doing any work whatsoever that was direct combat, and those were targeted based on priority. So if there's this big Taliban convoy that's moving around, I'm sure you're going to hit it, but they very quickly adapt. And so the Taliban has spread out. They're very good as a guerrilla force over the last 20 years, and have captured most of the functional regions in Afghanistan, especially in Pashtunistan. And them rolling into Kabul as an organized force was sort of just the last domino in a very long series that have been falling for years now. So I think my point there is to say that I think much of rural Afghanistan and Pashtun populated areas particularly have been under Taliban control for quite a long time. And I know, like, up in the Northeast, the Tajik groups have sort of maintained control of those areas to varying degrees for almost all of this last 20 plus year occupation. It's a fractured country, and I hope that we were giving opportunities all along here for people that wanted to get out, that supported us to get out. I think Biden's call on Congress to approve that or whatever is absolutely insane as well. But you know, some of this is just, you know, politics is normal.
You had talked about or referenced this idea of wanting to have legitimacy, the Taliban state in Afghanistan wanting to have legitimacy. I had seen earlier where China's foreign minister had expressed China's willingness to work with the Taliban, saying China respects the right of the Afghan people to independently determine their own destiny. And I think that was supposed to be a contrast between, well, you know, as opposed to the puppet state that America created, this bunch of Taliban people coming in and taking over against the will of the people. That's really the people determining their destiny independently.
Yeah.
And but that ultimately though raises this really big question about what the state is, right? So, you know, in the last 20 years, Afghanistan has provided us with two examples of how states might be formed. So in 2001, we had the U.S. invade, and they created essentially a puppet government there, and that's one way. And then this month, of course, the Taliban took over by force, and that's another way. Both are examples of some people overpowering others and forcing their will upon them, which is essentially what government is and always does. So in all this talk of legitimate and illegitimate governments, doesn't this reality suggest that all government really is violent and illegitimate, but that it's just a matter of degree and whether they are accepted? Because ultimately the question here is, are the people going to accept it, and is the international community going to accept it? And if they do, that means that the Taliban becomes legitimate, right? And if anybody who takes over a country or people violently, if all it takes is for a lot of other people to say, sounds good to me, and then they're legitimate, I think that really casts doubt on the legitimacy of the state everywhere at all times. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in broad terms, for sure. I'm an anarchist, and I'm a right anarchist. So despite being morally and practically opposed to state power, I also respect and want order relative to chaos. One of the things I couldn't help but think as the Taliban rolled into the capital is the interesting juxtaposition between like a startup culture and this bureaucratic leviathan that the U.S. has become. They're in the process of, you know, extracting U.S. troops, and you can't imagine the mountains of paper and ink that requires to get them out of there, and, you know, close the computers the right way and make sure all the correct emails were sent and passwords were passed on and yada, yada, yada. And all the while, the Taliban were just like, what if we take it now? Like, what are you going to do? And, you know, it becomes, despite Blinken's constant reminders that this is nothing at all like Saigon, it became a scene very reminiscent of the end of Vietnam, where, you know, the mask had been kind of pulled, and we now see that the actual military presence of the U.S. had really been symbolic over the last few years. And, you know, if the Taliban are able to consolidate support from the people that they rule, and, you know, the consent of the governed is a tricky term often, but in these moments, these you know, seed-bearing days of a state, I think that you really can get the opportunity to get some consent from the governed. You really can have an opportunity to exert some sort of, potentially, some sort of change or action, something far more tangible with your startup government in the Taliban than you could today, you know, going and arguing at the town council for restitution or whatever. So it is an interesting time to be thinking about these questions and how a state is born, and what gives legitimacy to a state, And we're going to get to see how the Taliban navigates that. I think that they thus far have done an okay job of, strategically, and then on the PR side. So I don't know what the answer is as far as authority goes, though. I mean, let me ask you a question. If we live as we are today in Afghanistan as anti-government or pro-small government, and we don't consent to the Taliban rule, what does that leave us with?
Yeah, I think that means you might be killed, right?
Or what if you just live your life as an agrarian farmer, building, growing cauliflower because you can't do opium anymore, and you just live your life. You just have your family and your kids and your wife, and you do your thing. You don't consent whatsoever to the government that's now in charge. Maybe you didn't to the republic beforehand, but what does that mean for you?
Can you be more specific with the question? Like, what does it mean for you?
What does it mean for you, Cody Cook, as the agrarian farmer who doesn't consent, and how does that look different? I guess what I'm trying to drive at ultimately, how does that look different than the way we live right now?
How does it look different from the way you and I live in the United States?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference has to do with those places where the state is going to interfere, whether you like it or not. So even if you can live 95% of your life with no state interference, what about those places where the state is going to use force against you, against your will, where so maybe it's not so bad for me, the agrarian farmer, but maybe it's not so great for my wife, who might be a school teacher, or who wants to be in the media, or who has certain gifts in a corporate or business world, but isn't allowed to exercise them. And so I think it does matter. Assuming that we're talking about someone who's rural and stays rural, I mean, that's fine. But ultimately, the way that a country is able to improve its lot is through trade, through expanding markets, through division of labor, and through, I mean, these sort of shared cultural and social and economic experiences. And I think the Taliban is going to just, and not in a different way, but also in some very similar ways to the way the United States government does things, is going to interfere with that freedom. And so I think anybody who's able to live their life as freely as possible without as much interference, whether they're in Afghanistan or the United States, that's great, but the state is going to interfere at different points.
Just to be clear, there's absolutely huge differences. That my point isn't so much about like the material life, but the philosophical one, for someone who doesn't consent. And my point in asking the question, and the thing I'm trying to drive home in this whole question of like authority and the derivation of authority for a state, is that there are always going to be huge subsets of people who don't consent, don't agree, don't want to be a part of it, and can very easily continue to choose the life that many have chosen throughout human history of just you can be discontented, you can disagree, you can withhold consent privately. But I think especially in a country like Afghanistan that's so impoverished and lacks so much of the things that we take for granted here in a material sense, but also in like in a political sense, that there aren't political action groups coming out to knock on your door and ask you what issues you care about in Afghanistan. That they're completely removed in many areas of this country from politics. And so I think the way that the Taliban is going to arrive at some idea of authority and ergo work towards international acceptance is to act like a state and, fake it till you make it, like every other state has, and, form some, even if it's completely farcical, like, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea or whatever, like make a constitution and see what happens, and tell the people that, Jucha is the way, or Sharia is the way, or however it goes, and stick to the rules that you set out, and parse it out in the localities. I think that ultimately Afghanistan is probably closer to like a federalist's dream than we're giving it credit for. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to try to rule, and I don't think you ever will truly rule Afghanistan from Kabul or Kandahar. I think many of these areas are ethnically homogenous and not interested in a group that isn't their own.
So, I mean, to be clear, it sounds like what you're saying is because Afghanistan is so agrarian and disconnected, on some level, the individual Afghani person who's not in the city, for example, may find more freedom than someone in the United States. Is that essentially what you're saying?
No, but maybe. I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends on what your idea of freedom is. You know, I'll put it this way, I wouldn't choose the life of an agrarian Pashtun farmer over the life that I'm currently living, despite my dissatisfaction with the U.S. state. But my point, I guess, is that when we talk in terms of like the Taliban and authority and what that means for the people in Afghanistan, I think we have to remember that, like, there's nothing quite new under the sun here. This has happened, you know, this has happened innumerable amounts of times where states power changes hands in these various states, and people find a way to navigate within the new structure, and maybe they can, you know, be particularly clever and try to exert some change in the direction that they see fit. But ultimately, the longer a state becomes sort of entrenched in the culture and the operations of the day to day, and I think sort of the sclerotic outcome of every stable equilibrium leads to sort of tacit consent, and you know they're going to face a ton of upheaval in that country one way or the other, because it's extremely artificial what they're trying to do in a orders of magnitude more than even the US, where federalism makes a lot of sense in maybe the late 17, early 1800s. These are ethnically homogenous cultures that are stuffed into a box, kind of like Iraq, which at the time was referred to as like a boiling pot that Saddam was the cap on, because there's these groups with huge sectarian strifes that date back tens or hundreds of years that are not going to be solved because the Taliban say so.
So, I mean, it's possible that I've missed a little bit of the force of what you're saying, but just as kind of maybe try to camp out here just for a minute, there are these, you know, kind of libertarian anarchists that are call themselves agorists, who are interested in saying basically, well, we probably can't, you know, just completely do away with the state right now, but what we can do is we can choose to live our lives in such a way that we kind of help to starve the state out, that we sort of ignore the state. And that is both easier and harder to do here than it will be with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So on one level, it'll be easier because we will not have, maybe the Taliban is trying to exert a kind of aggressive, oppressive, violent force that the United States usually doesn't. But it also will be, it's also going to be harder in one sense here, because the government manages to sort of touch on our lives in all these little ways that are really hard to escape. Whereas, like you said, the agrarian farmer can sometimes ignore the Taliban, but at other times, you know, his very life may be at risk, or the lives of people in his family may be at risk for just trying to mind their business and do what they want to do. And so I think I want to emphasize the ways in which all states are similar, but I think we can also emphasize ways in which you know, some can be more dangerous or threatening than others. And I think the Taliban, as much as the United States did some really stupid things in Afghanistan and some really oppressive things in Afghanistan, there were also things that sort of came as a byproduct of America being there that were in many ways, I would say, better for the people in Afghanistan. And some of those benefits are now going to go away because the Taliban is going to try to have increased control over the lives of these people. I mean, would you say that's correct or no?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I don't know what that means in a like deontological sense, though. Like, what is our duty if we accept that? I reject the idea that some good that came from this occupation necessarily means, and I know that this isn't what you're trying to argue, but it very much is what some are trying to argue. What does that mean for us pulling out now? And doesn't that mean that we have some sort of duty to school-aged girls in Afghanistan to get them educated or something? To be completely honest, and from a strict libertarian ethics point of view, I don't care about education in young girls in Afghanistan in a policy sense. It can be terrible, and it can be something that people wanted to direct change towards. But the one way that you can almost assure you're not going to solve that intractable problem is by parking a bunch of armored vehicles and shooting anybody who disagrees with it from some invading force. I don't know of a great example of a country that, because of its sort of third world status or cultural hindrances to what we would consider progress, is a success story in these terms. Maybe some of the more secular Middle Eastern states like Syria or Iraq have seen more progress as governments have changed. But it's interesting to me that with those liberations or liberalizations rather in these populations also comes a lot of state-driven policies that the U.S. are completely opposed to, and then we end up invading and turning to rubble these cities on a hill. So I don't know. I just, what I do know is that we shouldn't be there. We shouldn't have been there. We shouldn't have invaded there. And that every step along the way, the premise has been false or manufactured. And the best argument for staying in Afghanistan or invading Afghanistan crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains when Osama bin Laden did, and went to Pakistan. So maybe we should have invaded Pakistan. But Al-Qaeda won the war we fought against the Taliban. That's all I see out of this war in Afghanistan.
Well, so last question. Do you think there's a way forward for a free or freer Afghanistan?
Way forward. I mean, so in terms of freedom, I would put being an occupied state from an invading army right around the top of the list as unfree. And so I think the U.S. and Western forces leaving is a positive step ultimately. Next would be that the various groups of people begin to exert their political will towards whatever ends that they see fit. And so if large swaths of territory in Pashtun dominated Afghanistan are happy to live under Sharia law and the edicts of the Taliban, then they're going to be really happy with the recent developments. And if people in the north under what used to be the Northern Alliance are happy under that state, then maybe they can declare sovereignty of that region and have their own state of southern Tajikistan or whatever. But I think decentralization and a move away from these artificial terms that we think of the state being is a really important step that will probably never be taken, because we're talking about Afghanistan and about the Taliban in very Eurocentric central government terms that are artificial and also very sort of specific to our way of governing and thinking about governance. And so I don't even think it would occur to the average Afghan in Helmand province that, if he could just get a vote in this next election, he could feel a lot more comfortable with the state of things. I just don't think they think in those terms in many respects. And so,
well, so you've talked a little bit about sort of federalism and subsidiarity of kind of letting these decisions go down to a local or smaller level. And I think that becomes part of what it means to be freer. But I feel like it doesn't go all the way. So, for example, in Mississippi in the 1960s, you could get away, or white people could get away with lynching black people. And the FBI sort of got involved and tried to address that issue. Now, in that case, the federal government was throwing its weight around and telling local and state governments what to do. However, they were looking out for the individual, and I think that's where freedom really starts, with the individual. Because even if there's a segment of Afghanistan that wants to live under Sharia law, for at least the majority do. Let's say all the men do. That doesn't mean all the women do, or all the young girls do, and they don't have a say.
This isn't a culture that pre-Taliban gave any credence or political power to women anyway. That's again a very westernized lens to look at the terms of Afghanistan. Women that would don a burqa because of a government edict are living significantly different lives than the average Western woman. And I think we have to accept that in certain respects. The best way to win that argument for women liberation or whatever is not going to be in the way that we're doing it. It's going to be by, making the argument in an international way, not starving people, not bombing people, not killing people, not exerting political force against people from externalities. Because as soon as these huge Leviathan states start getting involved in what ultimately in these terms are extremely small policy issues or cultural issues, you're now making it a matter of oppositional credibility to maintain the policy despite this Leviathan force. There are groups in the Middle East, the Taliban may be among them, I'm not sure, who legitimately view the U.S. as the Rome of their Quran scriptures, who are the Antichrist or the devil, the powers of Satan. And so if the powers of Satan are telling our women to remove their burqas, what does that tell you? You can hear it very easily in evangelical terms by just changing the terms out a little bit. And so we're not going to win that argument by saying that you should let the women take their burqas off. We're going to win the argument by sending them books and trading with them and letting the merchants, show up and a woman's driving the ship. And that's how progress is made. Progress is made through peaceable terms, not through, this existential threat that we're constantly trying to lord over these people with.
Yeah, so no, and that's all very well said. Yeah, and I'm not saying that the way we deal with this problem is to stay in Afghanistan. I asked some sort of questions, do we have ethical responsibilities? Because I think it's an interesting question that people are going to ask. But yeah, I'm not saying that the way we solve these problems is to stay in Afghanistan. I think that us being in Afghanistan has been overall probably better for a lot of the women there, but it was the wrong decision to make, right?
Think about what you're saying. War has always actually the woman who the very first female congressman who voted against the U.S. entry into both world wars and was, I think, alone in voting against entry into World War I, was from Montana. I can't think of her name at the moment, but she was a hard leftist. I think she might have been like a Emma Goldman light as far as like her political philosophy. But she argued that women are actually, they bear the brunt of war burdens overall. And, you know, that argument has been made by other people as well. And I think in some respects it's kind of goofy, but in one way it's fundamentally true. These women are are mothers and wives of men and sons who have been churned through the meat grinder for the last 20 years, explicitly because of U.S. policy, and are now enveloped in a civil war that is very much the U.S.'s responsibility. And I don't know that because some of their daughters are allowed to go to school, that's a net gain for them. Maybe
not
socially.
Their daughters aren't not allowed to go to school, but so their daughters aren't being stoned in the streets, for example. Right? I mean,
but their daughters are still being stoned in the streets. They just have less of them, or now they have less men to potentially choose from because we've killed so many sons and husbands.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and you know, do you ever see the Monty Python film Life of Brian?
No.
It's kind of it takes place in you know, Judea when Jesus is around. But anyway, there's a bit where you have these sort of Jewish rebels against the Roman state, and they're meeting in secret. And one of them says, "Well, what did the Romans ever do for us?" And then somebody goes, "Well, they built roads." Yeah, okay. Apart from the roads, what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, there's the aqueduct. Okay, apart from the roads and the aqueduct, what did the Romans ever? Anyway, and so I think in saying that there have been some benefits that have been accrued, I'm not arguing that the invasion was a good idea. I do think that hopefully, maybe having tasted some of these freedoms, maybe that will make Afghanistan want it more. The people of Afghanistan want it more and less tolerant of Taliban rule. But I think we'll just have to see about that. I think what we did ultimately was artificial, and you're right, it was not enough to make them care about keeping the country the way it was, because they didn't really feel like it was their country. It was something that they were doing for us for a paycheck. So, but what I would like to see ultimately, and I agree with you, you know, Afghanistan's a different kind of country. Women are treated differently there. The political philosophy is different. But I am interested in trying to figure out if there are ways that all of us could become more free than we are now. That we could, you know, desire freedom and free trade, and that we would be less tolerant of people using force against us, whether it's the United States government or the Taliban or whomever, that the individual rights to bodily autonomy and to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would be strengthened and respected. And so from my standpoint, you know, we'll have to do the calculus later and see if Taliban rule or United States rule will be worse for people in Afghanistan. But I'm not happy about either. And from a human rights standpoint, I don't think anybody should be.
Yeah, it's a terrible circumstance, and often political order in Afghanistan's history has come from competing, you know, bloody-handed warlords with provincial mindsets who you know, rule over their smaller communities, and I think that's sort of the inevitable political equilibrium in Afghanistan and many of these agrarian Middle Eastern countries with, like, you know, these deep-seated sectarian strife sorts of issues. I think that you know, there's the only way to really have some sort of like genuine order in the way that we think about it is for people to be able to like provide for themselves in ways that they are accustomed, and to not be under constant threat of unanticipated death from whatever external power is ruling. And so, you know, these warlords may be the best that we can come up with for right now. But, you know, there are 2 points that I wanted to address from what you said. One was the Roman rule in Judea and the sort of joke there. But I think the fundamental difference, and it's a stark one, is that Rome created legitimate political stability in Judea, despite the protestations, rightfully so, of many of the Jewish people, and particularly of like the rebel groups of those times. There wasn't this sort of disorder that there is in Afghanistan now. That's been created by the U.S. And to the point about like individualism versus federalism or whatever, I think that you're absolutely right. I just think that individualism is one end of a spectrum and federalism is closer to it. And maybe, warlord federalism is better than, I don't know, Joe Biden saying that we're gonna liberate women or something. I just think Afghanistan has to deal with Afghanistan, and Afghans have to deal with Afghans. And as messy and terrible as it's probably going to be in the next few years, that outcome was inevitable. And I just hope that the least amount of bloodshed possible is the outcome. Yeah. And we were talking a bit about our Christian perspective on this, and that really is like my undergirding philosophy on my views on war. And you're absolutely right. I would love to see, the American and Western churches making real inroads in terms of outreach and whatnot to these communities, Christian or otherwise, in Afghanistan that are isolated and in need of the gospel. And I think that could, really be beneficial too. It's just not even necessarily couching it in explicitly religious terms, but churches that reach out to even send Qurans or Western books or hooked on phonics or something, like building a network in Afghanistan of cooperation amongst the West sounds like a much better foreign policy to me.
Yeah, my Christianity and my libertarianism overlap, but they're not the same thing. Christianity and libertarian philosophy aren't the same. But one thing they do have in common is they ask the question, how do we make a better world without initiating force, without using violence? And so that is what I want to see happen in Afghanistan. Obviously I want to see the gospel in Afghanistan. And I'd also like to see more political freedom, more economic freedom, more freedom for women, and so on and so forth. And that has to do with, removing the initiation of force. And unfortunately, we don't fix that problem by invading. But I also am fearful for Afghanistan under the Taliban as well, because there's also a great threat of the initiation of force there. So I hope that everyone will be praying for the people of Afghanistan as in this really tumultuous time, and I hope that there's a way forward for them to be a freer and more prosperous people. Yeah. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about it. It's a mess, but I appreciate you sharing your insight and your experience in this situation, into this kind of situation we're dealing with right now, because it's very complicated and confusing. And while I've got my basic philosophies, it's been hard for me to follow all the twists and turns, not just in the last couple weeks, but just since we've been there. It's just been such a complicated mess. And I think you had said in a previous discussion that we'd had that there was kind of a joke told amongst U.S. soldiers that they didn't really even know why they were there, that there was a sense that there was not a clear mission. And obviously that's going to that's a bad sign.
Right. And I've seen a lot of talk amongst former military buddies and whatnot about what this means, and the vanity of it all. And I am sympathetic to that. And I think ultimately they're right. And if us pulling out of Afghanistan and the Taliban officially taking the reins of government is what elucidates that point, then that's maybe better late than never. But to veterans or the patriotic amongst us who see this as some sort of like red pill wake up call, there's been people that have been saying this the entire way through, and the truth is that it's the case in every contemporary American foreign policy venture of my lifetime, certainly, and probably arguably of the post World War II period. Global military hegemony, even on its own terms, doesn't work in these sorts of conflicts, and you only weaken your global power and influence by getting into these quagmires. And so it is in vain, and it's terrible, and every American that's died in Afghanistan has died for nothing. And it's a terrible thing to hear and to say and to think, but it's also the terrible truth. And it's not a terrible truth that I've come up with, but that is necessarily true in a military venture like this. And we inherently knew it even then, right? As I had said before, that there was this sort of intuition that we weren't really understanding why we were there or what we were doing. It turns out that was actually the case right along, from their goofball idiot truck drivers all the way to the presidents and policymakers. We weren't going to remake Afghanistan in our image, nor were we going to do that in Iraq or Syria or Libya. We weren't going to create women liberation movements. We weren't going to make the world safe from terrorism. We've maybe only done the exact opposite of all of those things, inevitably. And maybe the women's liberation is just the next major domino to fall. And maybe that goes even more to strict Taliban policy in response to the Satan forces recommending it. And so, it just, again, is another hash mark as to why we need to keep our military out of these ventures, and keep our blood and treasure here in the U.S. doing functional, cooperative, innovative things instead of trying to kill people into submission, force is not a net good ever, in these sorts of arenas, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know.
Yeah, obviously invading Afghanistan and then telling them that they should want certain things didn't make them want it. Right.
And
it's never going to, and we need to stop it.
Yeah.
No. John, I appreciate your time. And so antiwarwarvet.com is still in existence, even though you're very busy being a dad and everything else?
I think I'm still paying for the domain. Yeah. And if I'm not, it might be like antiwarwarvet.wordpress.com or something. In the next few years, I'm hoping to get back into being a productive writer, and I'm trying to keep my goals a little bit more manageable. I'm not really doing the Instagram page anymore, but at antiwarwarvet is still live. I just am not active on it. I still lurk Twitter a bit. But if you want to get in touch with me, antiwarwarvet@gmail is a functional email I still respond to. Yeah, hopefully I'll have some news for you one way or another eventually, or maybe we'll do that podcast about nothing, and we can talk more there.
Cool. And antiwarwarvet.com is still up. Needs some new posts, but hopefully people will check in and see what is there and keep up with it to see if there's any new updates. All right. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Cody.